I never thought a broken rainwater pipe would be the reason I drove out to the old warehouse that Thursday afternoon. But that's how it started, something small, something ordinary, pulling me somewhere I hadn't planned to go. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old. I spent 37 years as a structural engineer, and I know better than most that it's the small things, a hairline crack, a loose bolt, a pipe left unchecked through winter, that bring the whole structure down eventually. I just never imagined that lesson would apply to my own family. My son, Callum, had been missing for 19 days. 19 days of police interviews. 19 days of sitting by the phone. 19 days of my second wife, Renata, placing a hand on my shoulder and saying, "They'll find him, Gerald. He's a grown man. He'll turn up." She said it so smoothly, so consistently, that I'd almost started to believe her. Almost. Callum was 22. He'd been studying environmental science at the University of Wollongong when he disappeared in late March. His flatmates said he'd mentioned visiting me, visiting the old workshop property I still owned out past Robertson, up in the Southern Highlands. But he never arrived. His car was found parked on a side street in Bowral, keys still in the ignition, phone on the passenger seat. The screen was cracked, like it had been dropped in a hurry. The detective assigned to the case, a tired-looking woman named Senior Constable Prue Madden, told me there was no sign of foul play, that Callum might have left voluntarily, that young men sometimes needed space from their families. I knew my son. He wouldn't leave his car. He wouldn't leave his phone. And he wouldn't leave me, not without a word. His mother, my first wife Diane, had died of a brain aneurysm when Callum was 11. It had been just the two of us for 6 years before I met Renata. We didn't leave each other without a word. That was our rule. That was the only rule we had ever needed. I'd married Renata 4 years ago, in 2022. She was 51, sharp and composed, a commercial property developer who managed a portfolio of leased buildings across the Southern Highlands and down toward the coast. She'd been married once before briefly, she said, in her late 30s, and had no children of her own. She and Callum had always been polite to each other. Careful. I'd told myself that was enough. That warmth would come with time. I was a fool. That Thursday, I drove out to the warehouse. Not because I suspected anything. I drove out because the property manager for the Robertson site had called to say a section of guttering had pulled away from the fascia after the recent storms, and water was pooling against the eastern wall. It was my property. My responsibility. Renata had been using it for the past 2 years as overflow storage for one of her development projects, architectural salvage, she called it. Old timber beams, heritage tiles, Federation-era ironwork she bought at auction and resold to renovation clients at a handsome margin. I'd let her use the space without charge. It was the least I could do, I'd thought. I parked on the gravel beside the roller door and walked around to the eastern wall first to check the guttering. It was as bad as reported. A full meter of downpipe had separated, and rainwater had been sheeting directly against the sandstone foundation blocks. I made a note to call a plumber. Then I walked to the side entrance to let myself in. I had a key. I'd always had a key. It was my building. After all, even if I rarely came out here anymore. The side door was a heavy steel thing that Renata had installed when she started using the space. A new lock, a keypad on the inside. She'd given me a key, but I'd never needed it until now. The interior smelled of old timber and dust, the way it always had. High ceilings, exposed trusses, afternoon light cutting through the skylights in long, pale columns. On the left side, stacked neatly on pallets, were the salvage materials I'd expected. Wrapped bundles of hardwood floorboards, stacks of sandstock bricks, several Federation fan lights propped carefully against the wall. On the right side was something I hadn't expected. A workbench had been set up along the entire eastern wall. On it sat 3 computer monitors, all dark, and a bank of what looked like network switching equipment. Not salvage hardware, not renovation supplies. This was operational, recent. I stood there for a moment, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Renata was tech-savvy. Yes, she managed her portfolio digitally, but this was not the setup of a property developer tracking her lease agreements. This was something else entirely. I walked closer. On the workbench, half hidden beneath a folded drop cloth, I noticed something that stopped my breath entirely. A University of Wollongong lanyard, blue and gold, with the UOW logo, and clipped to it, a student ID card, Callum Whitmore. 3rd year, environmental science. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The photo was my son's, his dark eyes, the small scar through his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident when he was 14. I stood there holding his lanyard in a building that belonged to me, in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation that I could reach for. I almost called Senior Constable Madden right then, but something stopped me. Not fear, not confusion, a cold, deliberate instinct that told me, if I call now, before I understand what this is, evidence disappears. Renata would be notified, and whatever was here would be gone before the police arrived. I knew how quickly things could vanish when the right people had warning. I'd learned that much from watching Diane's estate get picked apart by solicitors after she died, how fast paperwork could disappear when someone wanted it to. So I kept moving. At the far end of the warehouse, behind the last row of salvage pallets, there was a section of wall I didn't recognize. The warehouse was rectangular. I knew its dimensions from the original building survey. This wall was in the wrong place, set forward by perhaps 2 meters from where the eastern exterior wall should have been. I pressed my palm flat against it. Plasterboard, freshly installed. The smell of compound and primer still faint beneath the dust. I ran my hand along the edge until I found a seam. Then a hinge, painted over and almost invisible. Then, set into the skirting board at floor level, a small steel latch. I crouched down. My knees ached. 63 years and a lifetime of crawling around construction sites. I flipped the latch. The panel swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond it was a room. It wasn't large, perhaps 4 meters by 5. A camp stretcher along one wall, a small bar fridge, humming, a chemical toilet in the corner behind a curtain, a single LED batten light on the ceiling, casting everything in flat white, and on the stretcher, curled on his side beneath a gray blanket, was my son, Callum. The word came out barely above a whisper. He didn't move at first. I crossed the room in 3 steps and put my hand on his shoulder, and he flinched so violently he nearly fell off the stretcher. "It's me," I said. "It's Dad. Cal, it's me." He looked up. His face was thinner than I'd ever seen it. His eyes took a moment to focus, the way eyes do when they've been in limited light for too long. Then recognition came, and with it something that broke me completely, relief so profound it looked like pain. "Dad." His voice was rough, barely there. "Dad, how did you—" "Don't talk yet," I said. He nodded. I helped him up. He was unsteady, but upright. I could see he'd been fed the bar fridge, had water bottles and packaged food, but his legs had the wobble of someone who hadn't walked properly in weeks. I kept my arm around him. "We need to go," I said. "Right now." "She has cameras," he said. "In here." "Outside." That stopped me. I looked up and found it immediately, a small lens mounted in the upper corner, a red standby light glowing. I looked at Callum and he looked at me, and I made a decision. "Then we move fast," I said. "And we call the police before she knows we're gone. The moment we're outside and you've got signal, you dial 000. Not me, you." Your voice, your statement. Understood? He nodded. We walked out of that room, back through the warehouse, and out through the side door into the cold Highland afternoon. The moment his phone I'd brought mine got signal at the end of the gravel drive. I dialed 000 and handed it to Callum. He told them everything in a voice that shook but did not stop. I stood beside him, with my hand on his back, and listened to him describe 19 days I would spend the rest of my life trying to understand. Senior Constable Madden arrived within 40 minutes with 2 additional units. I met her at the gate. The camera feed goes somewhere, I told her. Probably to those monitors on the workbench. You'll want forensics on all of it before anyone touches anything. She looked at me steadily. Mr. Whitmore, this is your property? It is. And your son was being held inside it. He was. She was quiet for a moment. Then, we'll need to speak with your wife. I know, I said. What came out over the following days was worse than I had imagined. And I had imagined a great deal during those 19 days. Renata had not acted alone. Her business partner, a man named Troy Edgecombe, 58, who ran a boutique development consultancy out of Moss Vale, had been the architect of it, if architect was the right word for something so vile. Troy had been Renata's former husband. The brief marriage she'd mentioned. She had neglected to tell me they still worked together. She had neglected to tell me quite a few things. Troy had discovered, through channels I still don't fully understand, that Callum stood to inherit a significant portion of a rural land parcel that had been placed in a family trust by Diane's parents before their deaths. Diane's parents, Callum's maternal grandparents, had purchased 240 acres outside Goulburn in the 1980s. The trust had quietly appreciated for decades. When Callum turned 25, full control would transfer to him. The current valuation, driven by infrastructure development moving through that corridor, was just under $3 million. Troy had been attempting to acquire that land through a shelf company at a fraction of its value as part of a larger development play. The obstacle was Callum. As the sole trust beneficiary, Callum had to either consent to the sale or be removed from the equation long enough for paperwork to be filed through alternate legal channels. Renata, as my wife, had access to information about the trust that I had shared with her in confidence: family, financial matters, legal structures. The name of Diane's estate solicitor in Canberra, she had used all of it. The plan, as investigators later explained it to me, was never intended to be permanent. Callum was to be held, kept fed, kept alive, kept out of contact for long enough that Troy's solicitors could file documentation claiming Callum was incapacitated or unreachable, and that a court-appointed administrator should manage the trust. It was a fraud, an elaborate, monstrous fraud, built on the body of my son's captivity, the lanyard. I kept thinking about the lanyard on the workbench. Callum told me later that Renata had taken it from him the first day, had told him she needed it for documentation purposes. He said she had seemed almost businesslike about it. Efficient. That detail haunted me more than anything else. The efficiency of it. Renata had been arrested at our home in Bowral at 6:30 on the evening that Callum was found. She was in the kitchen when the police knocked. She had made pasta for dinner, pappardelle with a mushroom ragout. I know this because the detective told me, almost as an aside, and I haven't been able to eat pasta since. Troy Edgecombe was arrested the following morning at his office in Moss Vale. He told police it was a property matter, a civil dispute. He used the phrase contractual leverage to describe what he had done to my son. I will not describe in detail what I felt when I read that in the briefing notes Senior Constable Madden shared with me. Some things don't need to be said. Callum spent 2 nights in hospital dehydration, muscle atrophy, a vitamin deficiency that the doctors said would resolve fully with time. I slept in the chair beside his bed both nights. On the second night, He asked me how I'd known to go to the warehouse. A gutter, I said. He laughed. It was a thin sound, but it was real. A gutter. A length of downpipe pulled away from the fascia. Water pooling against the foundation. He was quiet for a moment. Mom always said you noticed the things other people walked past. I didn't trust myself to speak for a while after that. He was discharged on the Saturday. I drove him back to Wollongong myself, and on the way, we stopped at a bakery in Mittagong that he'd loved since he was a boy. One of those old-fashioned places that still does a proper vanilla slice, the kind with more custard than any reasonable structure should be able to contain. We sat at a table by the window and drank flat whites and didn't talk about any of it for almost an hour. We talked about his thesis instead, about the wetland rehabilitation project he'd been working on before all of this, about whether he wanted to finish his degree or take some time first. I want to finish, he said. I don't want her to have taken that from me as well. I nodded. That sounded like Diane's son. That sounded like my boy. The legal proceedings took 14 months. Renata pleaded guilty to charges of unlawful imprisonment and fraud-related offenses. Troy Edgecombe fought the charges, which only extended the process and, I suspect, deepened the sentence the magistrate eventually handed down. The trust remained intact. Callum retained full beneficial ownership. The Goulburn land was not sold. I sold the warehouse. I couldn't keep it. I understand, on a rational level, that a building is just materials, timber and steel and concrete block. But that room is still in there behind that false wall, and I don't want to own anything that contains it anymore. The sale settled in February. I used the proceeds to pay off the legal fees and donated the remainder to a family safety organization in Canberra that I'd come across during the proceedings. Callum suggested it. Of course he did. People have asked me since, people who know the story, friends from the engineering community, former colleagues, what the warning signs were, what I missed. And I've thought about that question more than I've thought about almost anything in my life. The honest answer is that the signs were there. Renata had always been curious about the trust, more curious than a step-parent had reason to be. She had asked, once, whether Callum had updated his legal documentation after turning 21. I'd thought it was consideration. Practical thinking. I'd been grateful for it. I had wanted her interest in my family to be warmth. So, I read it as warmth. That's what I missed. I'm not a man who speaks easily about mistakes. 37 years in structural engineering teaches you to be precise about failure, to examine it without sentiment, to understand exactly what gave way and why, so it never gives way again. I've tried to apply that discipline here. The structure failed at the foundation. I didn't check what I was building on. If you have a blended family, if you've brought someone new into your children's lives, please do not take trust on faith alone. Watch the small things. A good foundation doesn't announce itself. It just holds. And a compromised one doesn't either, not until the water gets in. Callum graduated the following November. Environmental science with honors. I sat in the third row of the graduation hall at Wollongong with an embarrassingly oversized bunch of native flowers, waratahs and banksias, and a spray of golden wattle that I'd driven 40 minutes to find because I wanted them to be exactly right. When he walked across the stage and they called his name, I stood up. I was the only one standing in that section, and I didn't care in the slightest. Afterwards, in the car park, he looked at the flowers and shook his head. "Dad," he said. "Don't," I said. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard enough of in the past 2 years. He took the flowers and held them like they were something worth holding. We drove back to Mittagong. We got another vanilla slice. The custard was, if anything, more structurally improbable than the last time. Some foundations hold. You just have to know which ones you built yourself.